Rockee, tell us about yourself and what motivated you to run for the Arizona State Legislature.
Sure. So I am a lifelong educator who has primarily worked as a school administrator until now serving as an assistant professor in educational leadership and policy at Arizona State University. And one of the biggest, reasons why I wanted to run for this particular seat is recognizing that, the state legislature is key to ensuring that we have workforce pipelines, that our education systems are strong, and that cities are supported in terms of the infrastructure that they're trying to build. And I have experience with that both from a helping families navigate our education systems to understanding the impact of education policy on all these different arenas. I think I have a unique background with my education, both having an MBA as well as a PhD. And so really kind of navigating sort of how all these systems really work together and being able to leverage that experience at the state legislature.
Okay. What professional or personal experiences best prepare you to represent the business community in Gilbert and the East Valley?
That's a great question. So, as I mentioned, I have a little bit of a business background in terms of my approach to education and my training. And I've also partnered with a lot of small businesses in my career in order to foster initiatives that support community development, economic development as an education expert. And I think particularly in Legislative District 13, we have a strong, thriving small business community in addition to large corporations, right? And so really being able to think strategically about how those entities are supported and work together. Sometimes the interests align, sometimes there's competing interests, and being able to leverage my collaboration experiences in order to make sure that the voices of our business leaders are heard and represented, and those needs are met as best we can.
Okay. Arizona has built a reputation as a pro-business state. What policies do you believe are the most important to maintain Arizona's economic competitiveness and ensure that businesses continue to invest and create jobs in Gilbert and throughout the state?
So I think, one of the, policy areas that, and it probably, you know, challenging to address, but the issue around local control. I think that, what particularly, Chandler and Gilbert have been able to do, they're able to do because of the uniqueness of those communities and those spaces. And when there's too much oversight at the state, a lot of times that is removed and businesses aren't able to, the communities aren't able to attract the businesses that they're trying to attract make it a desirable place. And so I think really thinking very strategically about how we protect some of that at the state legislature, I think is a big policy area. But another area is thinking about what types of tax structures and benefits, as well as I'm thinking about why it's top of mind, our child care tax credit and some of those things that really benefit business, or can benefit small business owners in particular, who often, especially if I know Arizona has a lot of like micro businesses, right? People who have employees of five or less. And so when you are taxed a certain way, that can be detrimental to your business. So really thinking about, making sure that those tax structures are beneficial, especially for small businesses, so that it's not a hindrance for businesses to start up and grow and have access to resources.
Am I up? Hi. What role should the legislature play in strengthening workforce pipelines through K-12 education, community colleges, universities, and care training programs?
So the legislature, to me, is absolutely critical in that space. I think that, currently, as an educator and someone who really understands our state budget, we currently significantly underfund these types of resources and pipelines. I think, not just with our K-12 system, but making sure that we're shoring up, apprenticeship programs. We're supporting these and we're allocating dollars and towards partnerships between, whether it be, some of our labor unions offer amazing apprenticeship programs, right? And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we have to be able to have the solid infrastructure that is funded to support those partnerships. Thinking about, EVIT and some of those other spaces that serve the K-12, level. But then beyond that, our community colleges, now are able to offer bachelor's degrees, which tremendously helps our communities, people who need access, who maybe don't have the financial capability of sending their child to an ASU or a U of A and so on and so forth. And so making sure that we are funding access to those programs that existed before have been cut by the legislature, and so reinvesting in those, and leveraging our partnerships with businesses, right? There's nothing like hands-on training. We have a lot of, thinking about legislative district 13 or nearby, there's a lot of manufacturing companies. There's a lot of all these things that have sort of hands-on training with their programs, but they have to have access to schools and spaces to be able to build those relationships.
Thank you. Switching to infrastructure, what role should the state play in supporting transportation and water infrastructure and other key systems necessary for continued business growth?
So I think that, that is definitely key. Transportation is probably one of the number one. Transportation and childcare, like the top two issues in the state in terms of barriers for folks. Most people want to live within 20 minutes of where they work. And so for businesses to be able to be successful, we have to have a solid infrastructure, and that includes making sure that we're thinking creatively, not just in terms of our roads and those sorts of things in partnership with our federal level, but also thinking about options that are available or businesses that actually support sustainable transportation models, and making sure that we're investing in those. But outside of that, the water piece I know is critical. I know that has been most recent in Gilbert, in terms of really thinking about how do we reduce our reliance on the Colorado River and creating, this sustainable water models. I think, and there are examples of that. I think Chandler has done a good job in terms of, thinking long term about, what are aquifer systems and how to do reusable water. But the state has to support that. The state has to, provide, we do a lot of subsidies and different things at the state. And I know we're challenged budgetarily, but we have to think creatively because we can't do anything without water. Businesses can't grow without water. We can't build housing without water, right? So we have to really think creatively on how we make access to this necessary resource, accessible in terms of the building the infrastructure and sustaining the infrastructure for the long term.
Continuing with that same topic, is there a specific transportation or infrastructure project that you feel is important for our community?
So I think that, I had a meeting with someone who's on the state transportation, I think it's a council of sorts, and they were talking about the challenge where people want to expand like public transportation versus other models. And I think that, thinking about my district, one of the things that, Chandler came up with was their and now I can't think of the name of it, but it's almost like its own Uber system, but free, to the public. And why that really intrigued me was because I think that having access to more public transportation doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because time is a resource. If people have to wait for a bus or whatever the case may be, and we're limiting, the amount of time it may take, that they have in terms of to and from work or picking up kids or whatever, our lives are so much more complex these days. And so I think from a transportation project perspective, for me, it's thinking about how do you increase access to transportation in an affordable way that also takes into account the time that people need. So, for example, I'm working with a company that specializes in affordable and reliable vehicles, right? It's putting money back in people's pockets, but now they can control their time. There are entities out there like that from a project that if we invest in and we can expand and really think about our state and the nuances of what's happening in our state, we can really address transportation in a real way.
Thank you. The next question has to do with housing. When it comes to housing availability and workforce housing, what policies, if any, should the state consider in stating to improve housing supplies while maintaining appropriate roles for local communities in planning and zoning decisions?
That is a heavy loaded question.
Yes.
Uh, I would say, the first thing that comes to mind is actually a bill that is, or was running in the legislature. It didn't move forward, but it's really thinking about how we, you know, create reasonable limits for corporations that are coming in and buying up housing stock. And I say that because, of course, corporate housing is important, especially for some of our larger employers. But what's happening is, especially in our district, we're unable to provide, the type of housing we need for first-time home buyers, access, when people are moving in, it's driving up the costs, and it makes it housing, home ownership inaccessible. And so thinking about, what is a reasonable cap for the amount of corporations or amount of corporate housing that can exist within certain areas, but also I think really this is where the relationship comes into play in terms of with city council or planning and zoning, as you mentioned, to really understand what's happening in Chandler might look a little bit different than what's happening in Gilbert, which might look very much different than Phoenix. And so how do we create a policy that takes into account those things? And I think that's where they've stalled at the legislature is this, a lot of things are really driven by city of Phoenix, which is not everywhere else, and we can't agree because our needs are different. And so I really think we have to really understand those nuances and then be able to build that plan. But I think it starts with making sure that we're kind of limiting who's buying up our housing stock that currently exists.
Well, thank you. How would you view the balance between state authority and local decision making when it comes to economic development, housing, and business regulations?
Mm-hmm. I think it's all of what we're talking about. As you hear me share, I think it's tricky, right? I think the role of the state is to be able to provide the umbrella policy, the boundaries, right? But cities should have some autonomy to meet the intricacies of their community, right? Like I chose to live in Chandler because of the culture of Chandler, right? I didn't choose a different place because that culture didn't meet what it was I was looking for in a community. They're able to do that when they have that kind of autonomy. When the state sort of overreaches too much, um, you know, cities aren't able to provide those things. They're not able to create that nuance and be competitive, so to speak. And I think that is important. But there has to be boundaries, right? We can't have significant inequities across our state that sort of hinder long-term certain populations of people, and we have to be careful of that. And so I don't think that there is a very clear line on housing should be local and economic development should be state. I think all of those areas have some level of local autonomy and some sort of umbrella sort of boundaries from the state that should exist.
Well, can you share a specific issue you hope to champion when it comes to balancing between local and state?
Absolutely. I mentioned it before about the housing. I do feel strongly that we do need to have a cap on the amount of houses that are bought up by outside corporations outside of the state of Arizona. that is a necessity, because especially in LD 13, we literally have a city there that has zoned areas that they want to be able to develop for first-time home buyers and new families, and they literally can't roll it out because of a lot of the restrictions that exist at the state right now. So I think rolling back some of that, putting some caps on these corporations, that's 100% what I want to champion.
Well, what role should the legislator play in supporting responsible water management while ensuring that communities like Gilbert can continue to attract businesses and residents?
Absolutely. So I think that we definitely need to review our water policy. Water is, we just had in Chandler, issue thinking about water in terms of data centers. Gilbert's having their thing in terms of needing to create some different infrastructure with less reliance on the Colorado River. I think at the legislature, part of it is making sure that we have reasonable requirements around water sustainability. Um, and that may be, saying that if, for instance, thinking about what recently happened in Chandler, if we're going to build a new, data center, there's some requirements on water recycling, right? Like, I think those are things that can happen at the state level. But back to my point about where cities should have some autonomy, what some of those structures look like should be dependent upon the needs of that community, and so I think the overarching policy is making sure that we have a plan for sustainability. I mean, we're in a desert, right? Water is at a premium, and so we have to ensure that we are thinking through that in the long term. And we have a lot of research on what water and water movement. I met with, side note, I know this might be more than 2 minutes, but I met with a faculty member at ASU who studies water patterns in Arizona. And part of that for me was understanding, okay, most cities are self-sustaining. We really just need to ensure that we can keep up with that infrastructure. So thinking about Gilbert, it's like, are there, subsidies that we can create in the state to help cities to, support the regular maintenance that you need for this type of infrastructure so that it's not pushed off on residents to foot the bill.
Well, and for our last question, what is one policy issue affecting Arizona business community that you believe the legislator should prioritize over the next 2 years?
I think back to where we started about workforce development. I think we're currently challenged in Arizona with a gap between the performance of our educational institutions and the needs of our businesses. I think, I've spent a few times going to events that the Chandler Chamber has put on and got to hear it from different, industries about like what their challenges are with, getting employees and moving them through. And there's a gap between like the kids that are coming out, and granted, some of the cream of the crop are, they're going on to 4-year institutions and so on and so forth. But we have, a large untapped labor force in Arizona simply because we are not investing the way that we need to in workforce development. And what that looks like to me is, how are we ensuring that apprenticeship programs are accessible for high school students and even as young as middle school, right? You're building pipelines. It's literally what you're doing. It can't wait until, okay, kids have graduated, now they're trying to find a job and they don't even know where to look. And so industry has, a very specific model that I think is way more advanced than our education systems. And so we have to be able to build that so that we are ensuring sustainability for our industry here in Arizona. And then also understanding what's available in terms of small business development, right? Like most entrepreneurs had, great ideas and they built something on their own, but that training, like they're just as valuable from a training perspective for kids who are coming out or even adults who are retraining or upskilling and so on and so forth. And so I think significant investment and that will help our business community in the long haul.